continue talking. Hello, everyone. In today's lecture, we're going to continue talking about tape music and also the establishment of electronic music studios, mostly in the United States. And today we're also going to talk about a shift that occurs from fixed pieces that are on tape to live electronic music. And that'll become more clear as we go on. So to start off, we're going to continue. Oh, here's a little bit of a overview of what we're going to talk about. So to start, we're going to talk about the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. And this was a music studio that was established very much in a similar vein to the types of studios that we saw in Europe and in Germany and in France, with the exception that this music studio was started at a university. So it was a collaboration between Columbia and Princeton University, and the studio itself was established in downtown Manhattan, but it was relatively easily accessible by students at both universities. So a little bit more about the history is that the studio itself was founded in 1957 with the support of a Rockefeller grant. And it was not the first electronic music studio established in the United States. There were several within a few years of each other, but it became known very quickly, partly because of its association with other international music studios. And a little bit of the backstory here is that in 1951, Ampex donated several tape machines to Columbia, in particular to a professor named Vladimir Usichevsky, who was a composition professor. And he composed pretty traditional compositions, really like orchestral music using orchestral instruments. And he thought that there would be a lot of potential to use magnetic tape when teaching things like music theory or ear training, that he could record things that students could then listen to over and over again. And he did that, but he also started recording with using the magnetic tape machine to make compositions. And it was kind of simple things that typically involved recording orchestral instruments and then modifying and manipulating the tape. And something that's important to note here is that really early on, he employed an assistant named Peter Mousy, who was really, really important and absolutely instrumental in basically teaching all of these kind of old school composition professors how to use this equipment. And in a lot of cases, he actually just used the equipment for them. And this was very common also at the WDR in Germany and at the RDF in France, that technicians were also often the ones just actually using the technology. And when composers would come to visit, they would just communicate their idea of what they wanted to achieve, but they wouldn't necessarily make the piece themselves using the technology. So it's important to note here that Peter Mousy was the assistant there for a really long time, the technician who did a lot of like maintenance and invention with the technology, but he also often was the one kind of using the technology for the composers. So Vladimir Usichevsky and another professor there named Otto Luning started to experiment and make pieces using this new tape technology. And then in 1952, they were able to do a concert at the NYC MoMA, or Museum of Modern Art, that was kind of coordinated by Leopold Stokowski, who's a famous conductor. And this kind of put their activities kind of on the radar of people in New York, and that kind of eventually led them to be able to get this Rockefeller grant to establish the studio. And the studio still exists in a slightly different form today. And one thing to mention, kind of like the studios in France and in Germany, is the people that worked here and that were able to compose at the studio were largely men, and pretty much almost all white people, with a couple exceptions. A lot of the times they would bring in international composers as like visiting composers. So Halim El-Dab spent a lot of time there. Mario Davidovsky spent a lot of time there. So people, composers of color and international composers were able to use the studio, but it was often as like a visiting composership. And it was pretty common that even if these people were coming in internationally, musically, they tended to have pretty traditional ideas. They tended to be kind of like Western European orchestral composition, using that kind of framework, using electronics. And that's something to mention, too, about Usichevsky, is that he was a European immigrant and as was auto-looning. And so this was very much a time, kind of like what we saw in Japan, where music education in the United States was really very in the shadow of Europe. And there wasn't necessarily this sense of like an American voice in composition, and students would by and large be taught kind of European musical traditions. And then that started to change later, and we'll see with different studios that was also different, but that was the case here. And kind of like what we saw with the assistant Peter Mousey, there were two women that kind of broke this mold of this almost exclusively male space, Alice Shields and Prill Smiley, who both served as the associate director of the studios at different times. However, they were never given full faculty positions, so they were kind of never recognized or paid the same amount as men. So it's kind of these common issues that we see today with like the gender wage gap. And these kind of like exclusive spaces where women and people of color really aren't made welcome or included. But Pearl Smiley in particular was able to compose pieces there, and she did spend a lot of time there and kind of open up the space to a certain degree to women and non-white and male people. So the piece that we're going to listen to that is our required listening today is a piece by Prill Smiley called Kolyosa, which in Russian means wheels. And I'll talk about that in a second. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about Prill Smiley. So she came to the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center in 1963 to work as Vladimir Ussachevsky's assistant, his like personal assistant, an apprentice. And she actually ended up, kind of like Peter Mousey, just making a lot of his pieces. So he might have a loose compositional idea, but she was the one actually, you know, recording things to tape, cutting the tape, putting it back together, and constructing the actual pieces. So this, again, kind of like what we saw at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, shows this sort of like division of labor and also sort of the erasure of the labor of basically non-white, non-male people in these spaces. However, she was the associate director from 1966 to 1982, so she was there for a really long time and worked to kind of open up the space to women in particular. So this piece, Kolyosa, again, it means wheel in Russian. The whole idea of the piece stems from kind of emulating circular spatial motions on tape. And she says here at the bottom, she wanted a portrayal of sound of an abstract hypocycloidal concept relating to images of whirlwinds, windmills, spinning wheels, and interlocking ellipses. So some of the things that she did to make this effect was she corresponded the length of a tone to the frequency of that tone. So that basically meant that very short tones were very high in frequency and long tones were lower in frequency. So she really equated tone and frequency. She also kind of equated space with distance. So things appeared close, medium, and far away, and used panning to create those kinds of effects. She also created sort of rhythmic counterpoint or interlocking rhythmic patterns. Lastly, she included something called a Doppler effect. And the most common experience that we have of the Doppler effect is when a car drives by, and it's like the frequency, the tone that we hear speeds up and slows down. So it's like, zhoo, when a car comes by. So she employed all of these effects to basically, again, create this kind of circular spinning motions in this piece. So please go to the required listening page and listen to this piece on your own. Okay, that's the end of part number 1. Coming up next, we'll talk about the shift to live electronic music in the United States. All right, so now we're going to talk about a shift from really fixed recorded music to live electronic music. And I should have mentioned in the last section about the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio that by and large, all of the pieces that came out of that studio were fixed to tape, which meant that they were all constructed using electronic tones and tape manipulation, and then they were put into a final form in a recording. So there was no way in which the piece could be recorded live. And that was also true of musique concrète in France and of electronische music in Germany, and of a lot of pieces also that came out of Japan. And so we see, especially in the 1950s and 60s, by and large, electronic music would have been tape music fixed to tape. So in a concert setting, that basically looked like having some large speakers on a stage, and people would sit in the audience and just listen to this pre-recorded music. And there were a lot of composers that were really unsatisfied with that. They felt that it was a really kind of subpar listening experience, and also a subpar experience as the composer, where maybe they had kind of a performance practice already and they wanted to include the potentials of electronics into a performance setting. And so the next composers that we're going to talk about really explored the ways in which this could happen. And so they also kind of established more like alternative studios and collectives, kind of more like Jike and Kobo. And so we'll talk about that now. So the first that I want to talk about is a group called the Sonic Arts Union, but they have kind of a long history to where they got to the point of being called the Sonic Arts Union. So it starts back in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the mid-1950s, and there were two composers, Gordon Muma, who is right here, and Robert Ashley right here, who were two young composers who were really interested in the potential for using electronics in live electronic music. And they were both kind of college-age students. I believe Robert Ashley was in school at the time, and Gordon Muma was kind of working odd jobs as an electrical engineer. And they decided that they were going to pool their equipment together so that they could kind of like have access to more stuff. And they established, basically between the two of them, the Cooperative Studio for Electronic Music in 1957. So again, that's the same year that the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio was founded. And again, I love that they gave themselves a name, but it was really just the two of them that made this studio. And something that we see with Muma and Ashley that we saw in other places is that a lot of the equipment that they were using was actually military surplus left over from World War II. So again, this is a real direct connection between electronic music and the technologies that were developed during wartime. And they had access to pretty rudimentary stuff. So they had a magnetic tape machine, they had access to circuits and radios and microphones and things like that. But because they kind of had access to pretty basic stuff, kind of like what we saw at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, that kind of led them to use that technology a bit more creatively than, say, people at the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio, who had access to a lot of equipment, but they didn't have to be as kind of scrappy about it. So they were part of this cooperative studio for electronic music, and they made pieces together and kind of, again, helped each other figure out how to use equipment and developed new equipment together. But they were also part of a group that was founded in 1961 called the Once Group. And the Once Group put on these annual festivals called the Once Festivals. And these were sort of multidisciplinary, experimental. It was a festival for the kind of performance of experimental artwork, and a lot of that kind of combined elements of theater, elements of visual art, elements of music, elements of dance, all kind of combined often in one kind of coherent piece. And so you can see here there's this kind of sense of these vibrant young people kind of coming together and creating kind of really cutting edge art. And it was, again, a real platform for sort of experimentation, but also for community. And a lot of the people that performed at the Once Festival, that kind of led to like long collaborations and long-lasting friendships and correspondences. And even though originally it kind of started with people that were just in Ann Arbor, before long people were coming from all over the country and all over the world to participate in these festivals. So people that we're going to talk about later, including Pauline Oliveros and Terry Riley and John Cage and Merce Cunningham, Robert Rauschenberg, all these people came to Ann Arbor for these festivals to participate in this sense of community and sense of experimentation and to present their work. And again, this kind of led to lifelong collaborations down the road. But they were short-lived because there was, as is common with experimental art, it's really hard to maintain consistent funding. And so they weren't able to continue funding it. But after that, in 1967, four guys that were involved with the once group, Robert Ashley, Gordon Muma, David Berman, and Alvin Lucier, started a performance collective called the Sonic Arts Union. And basically what the Sonic Arts Union allowed them to do, it basically created a group of kind of like-minded art makers and performers and composers to have a group where they could share ideas and tour together and perform each other's works, or at least a kind of group in which they could perform their own works on kind of a shared bill. And that became a really important support structure for them for a really long time. And again, something that we see here that's just as common in these kind of collectives as it is in these big studios, the Sonic Arts Union, you can see here in this picture of the once group, it's all white young people, but it's a mix of genders. There's men and women involved. But then when they come to form this group, it's all men. And that was very common. And so they often toured with women and people of color as well, but they were often relegated to kind of the role of performer and not often included as composers as well. And so that's, again, something that I'd love to talk about more in the discussion section if you're interested. So we are going to talk about a number of pieces by the Sonic Arts Union that are part of your required listening. So first I want to talk about a piece called by Robert Ashley, which he composed and performed at one of the Once festivals called Wolfman. And here he says that he took kind of a theatrical approach where he took on the persona of a nightclub singer, but then he does these really weird kind of like experimental techniques. And this is a piece for amplified voice, tape, and feedback. And basically what he did is he took a microphone and put it very, very close to his mouth, and then he intoned very precisely and changed the position of his mouth to basically create a kind of cavity in which sound from the room would go into his mouth and then back into the microphone to create a situation of feedback. And again, feedback is where if you're in a room and you have a microphone and you have a speaker, the sound of the speaker gets picked up by the microphone and reinforced and amplified and amplified and amplified until it creates kind of like a buzzing sound. And there's ways in which you can control feedback, kind of like Robert Ashley's doing by using his mouth cavity. And he had a very particular score for this, and the score was made up of written instructions broken down into phrases. Each phrase should be one breath long and also have continuous change. So that basically meant that the person performing this piece is supposed to continuously change their mouth position and change the tone that they're making to constantly shift the feedback in the room. And so it's very gradual change. And one thing that very gradual change does is it really allows the audience to kind of hear and understand the kind of technique and phenomenon that is happening. And I included a video of not Robert Ashley performing, but a more recent performance of someone performing the Wolfman on your required listening page. And that's a video, but there's also an MP3 of Robert Ashley performing it as well. Oh, and he said about the piece captures the full room feedback that allows even the smallest sound at the microphone to take on the illusion of moving around the room depending on the frequency and other aspects of the microphone sound. So this is something that we start to see with the Sonic Arts Union, where the acoustics of a performance space end up becoming extremely important as part of kind of the compositional makeup of a piece of music, which again is like, it's even different than Stockhausen or another or Varese moving the sound in space. Here they're using the acoustic properties of the space as a part of the composition. And one thing that's interesting about that is that every time the piece is performed, it would likely be performed in a different room. So it takes on kind of new elements every time it's performed. So the next piece I want to talk about is a piece called Music for Solo Performer by Alvin Lucier. And Alvin Lucier, who you'll also get introduced to in your assignment number 1, was part of the Sonic Arts Union. Hopefully you're a little bit familiar with his work by this point. his piece, Music for Solo Performer, predates the creation of the Sonic Arts Union, but he performed this piece with the Sonic Arts Union, and it's kind of emblematic of his approach to composition. And this is a really interesting piece. Basically, here's the score right here. It includes a performer that is hooked up to an alpha brainwave reader, and alpha brainwaves are produced when your eyes are closed and you're in a meditative state, but you're not sleeping. So it's this sort of in-between state between being awake and sleeping, where your mind can't be too active, but you also can't be asleep. Lucier got this alpha brainwave reader from Edmond Douin. So this alpha brainwave reader is connected to an amplifier, and then that signal is sent to a mixer, which is then sent around the room. And around the space, Lucier placed a number of speakers and a number of percussion instruments or general instruments to which he applied transducers, so smaller speakers that the waves then would be amplified and basically just transduced to those speakers. So it was a pretty low sound, which is why percussion was really a good tool for that, because it would be more of perceived as a beat than it would be perceived as a tone. So these alpha brainwave signals were sent throughout the room, and it's this kind of interesting effect where activity, this music sonic activity, is produced through the performer's inactivity. So the performer has to reach this kind of meditative state in order to create the musical activity. And he was really interested in that kind of dichotomy. And what we see with this piece by Lucier and others like I Am Sitting in a Room, Lucier is now kind of considered one of the forerunners of sound art, because there's kind of an architectural element of this piece where the instruments are kind of placed throughout the room, creating this sense of almost like sonic structures or sonic space. And again, we can see here that there's this element of feedback, and here the kind of feedback mechanism is the performer, where he's listening and also kind of responding, but there is this element of space and the performance space being important as well. And here's a video which you can click on in the slides, and I'm going to have you watch this on your own because, again, the volume doesn't really translate in these lectures. Okay, so the last piece we're going to talk about for the Sonic Arts Union is a piece by a composer named Gordon Muma called Hornpipe. And the biggest reason why I want to talk about Gordon Muma is that he actually taught at UC Santa Cruz for decades, and he founded the electronic music studio at UC Santa Cruz. So he's really part of your legacy as a student at UC Santa Cruz taking this class. And he actually started this class something like 30 years ago. So we are part of his legacy. And Gordon Muma, like the other composers in the Sonic Arts Union, was very much interested in feedback. He was interested in using electronics and kind of relating to the acoustics of space using electronics. So this piece, Hornpipe, kind of combines electronics and acoustic instruments in a live performance setting. So to make this piece, he created what he called a cybersonic console. And the cybersonic console was basically just an early analog computer. And what it did is it had these sensors, or these variable resonant filters, that were able to kind of pick up frequency bands in the room, so that when the room's resonant frequencies were activated, it then opened up gated amplifiers, which would then send out a sound signal into the room. And that, again, kind of created a situation of feedback where it might reactivate the room's resonant frequencies and then trigger the triggers again. So he also kind of created this interaction with the electronics and with the acoustic space by adding the element of a French horn. And he didn't, of course, being an experimental composer, just play the French horn like a classical instrumentalist would. He used what we call extended techniques, where he used different mouthpieces and he used different other attachments to create kind of extended sounds that you wouldn't necessarily normally hear when someone plays the French horn. And again, this creates this kind of really interesting situation of feedback and interaction between a performer, electronics, and the performance space, which again is really kind of common with the Sonic Arts Union composers. Okay, so that's it for part 2 of lecture 8. Up next, we're going to talk about the San Francisco Tape Music Center. So now we're going to talk about the San Francisco Tape Music Center, which, sort of like the Cooperative Studio for Electronic Music, was more of a collective than, say, the established studio at the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Center. So the background to the San Francisco Tape Music Center is that, well, first, before I say that, I want to say that it sort of coalesced around the same time as the Once Festivals and the development of the Sonic Arts Union. And they were actually friends with the people that were involved with the Once groups. Many of them performed at the Once Festivals, and there was a lot of similarities in their aesthetics and their goals as performers. And I think that overarching goal was to make electronic music more performative and bring it into a live performance setting. There's also a similar focus on process, so making a compositional or musical process more transparent to the listener. There was a real sort of do-it-yourself or DIY approach, again, that was more in. All of these people were using the technologies themselves. They weren't employing assistants or things like that to use the technology for them. And one of the differences with the San Francisco Tape Music Center is that it was really connected to San Francisco counterculture, so to the hippie movement and kind of drug culture at the time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And another difference is that in addition to being interested in process and live electronic music, they were very interested in improvisation. And again, this kind of connects, if you think about it, to San Francisco counterculture, where you have bands like the jam bands like Grateful Dead, and these kind of all-night jam sessions. They were really a part of that more improvisatory scene. So again, it's not just introducing electronics into performance setting, it's introducing electronics into kind of long-form improvisational settings. So the early days of the kind of proto-San Francisco Tape Music Center started in 1961 with a concert series called the Sonic Series that was held at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And this was held by some of the students there that included Terry Riley, Ramon Sender, and Pauline Oliveros. And here, this is where we really start to see their early experiments with live electronics, magnetic tape, and group improvisation. And again, here, group improvisation is slightly different than more kind of like traditional forms of improvisation that we see in, say, jazz, where with jazz, it's very common to have a chord chart with lyrics or kind of like a set kind of chord pattern or harmonic progression by which you go through the piece so that everyone stays together. Here at the San Francisco, with the Sonic series, these performers were very much interested in kind of group improvisation, which was more like spontaneous collective sound making. So there were no chord charts, there was nothing like that. People just kind of made sound together all at once, and it didn't matter if it all harmonically gelled or whatever. They were more interested in kind of just like collective sound making that they could come up with. So then in 1963, they established the San Francisco Tape Music Center at the KPFA studios in Divisadero, and they actually had another space before that on Russian Hill that burnt down. But many of you have probably been to Divisadero Street, so if you go there, you can think of the San Francisco Tape Music Center. And what was cool about this space at the KPFA studios is that they were in the attic, and it kind of served as more of like a studio by day and a performance space by night. So they held many concerts there, including the premiere of a piece by Terry Riley called In C, which is often kind of considered the first piece of minimalist music. Some of you might have heard of it. And they also held other concerts there, including the Tudor Fest, which featured the music of David Tudor. And of course, they also had concerts of their own music and other people's music there as well. So again, I want to kind of highlight how it was connected to San Francisco counterculture, in particular the Trips Festival. So many of the people that were involved with the San Francisco Tape Music Center made tape music at the Trips Festival, and this was kind of one of those all-night kind of music events where people would do acid and they would stay up all night and they would listen to music. And the music that the San Francisco Tape Music Center people made really reflected that kind of drug experience, where they were very long form, extended improvisations. They often included visuals, kind of like you've maybe seen of like those, like, it's almost like watercolors on a slide. I think there's another name for it that I'm now blanking on. So they were very much enmeshed in, like, actually enmeshed in this counterculture. And another thing that the San Francisco Tape Music Center kind of housed, that we'll talk about in a couple lectures, was the development of the Buchla synthesizer. They worked very closely with Don Buchla and developed this more kind of experimental approach to the analog synthesizer. So the San Francisco Tape Music Center kind of operated more as like an independent collective from about 1961 to 1966. And by 1967, they actually got a Rockefeller grant, just like the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio, to establish kind of like a more institutionalized studio. But the grant came with the stipulation that they had to have the backing of a larger institution or university. And so basically they were able to be taken in by Mills College in Oakland, where it still exists, and you can still take electronic music classes at the Tape Music Center or the Electronic Music Center at Mills College. And the first director of the San Francisco or the Tape Music Center at Mills was Pauline Oliveros, who's pictured here. And she was the director for about a year, and then Robert Ashley, who we just talked about, took over and was the director there for a number of years. But the Tape Music Center at Mills College was actually a really important studio in Oakland for a really long time. So one thing that makes the Tape Music Center different than other music studios that we see, kind of the radio station studios or the other university studios like the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Studio, is that it was open to the public. And I think that was also part of their Rockefeller grant, is that it stipulated that it had to be open to the public. And what that meant is that by paying just a very low fee, anyone could have access to the studio during certain hours. And since the studio was based in Oakland, that meant that for a number of years in the 80s and 90s in particular, a lot of rap albums were actually made at the Tape Music Center at Mills College. So that's kind of an interesting connection between this kind of more experimental history and the development of rap music and hip hop in Oakland. And the studio, I think by the mid-1990s, they removed the public access, which is kind of unfortunate, but it was publicly available for a really long time. So now we're going to talk about a piece that was made at the San Francisco Tape Music Center called Bye Bye Butterfly by a composer named Pauline Oliveros. So Pauline Oliveros was the only woman composer associated with the San Francisco Tape Music Center for a really long time. And she recounts that she had a very particular experience there, that she was often kind of put in the position of being an administrator and a manager for the studio. She was often kind of given like housekeeping tasks that like the guys involved wouldn't do. And so that's kind of an instance in which we see these kind of gender dynamics play out even in these more kind of collective studios. So this piece was made at the San Francisco Tape Music Center, and it employed a sort of set of techniques that Oliveros developed in the 1960s called her tape delay techniques. And basically, we talked about tape delay when we talked about B.B. Barron. It's various ways of basically putting a tape loop through two different tape players, and that creates different feedback effects. And so what we see here, there's the source that goes in, it's in record mode, and the input or the output of one tape recorder goes into the input of the other, and then that output is fed back into the input of the first tape recorder. And Pauline Oliveros was really interested in this feedback technique. And one thing that's really interested in these early days of tape delay is that the amount of delay depended on the actual physical space between the two machines and the length of the tape loop. So you could create different effects, like literally based on the space between the two machines. And Oliveros was really interested in kind of creating a system that she could kind of improvisationally explore in a performance. And so what she would do is she would set up this tape delay system, and then she would experiment with various inputs to that system. And throughout a performance, she would just let everything run, and she would turn knobs and change speeds and change amplification and just kind of explore that system in real time in performance. And Bye Bye Butterfly is one of those pieces. And for this piece, she used a turntable with a record, 2 tape machines, 2 oscillators, and actually 2 amplifiers that were kind of amplifying the oscillator's signal. So beyond just using tape delay, this piece was also sort of a feminist statement by Oliveros. She used a record of Puccini's Madame Butterfly, which was kind of one of the oldest, or I mean, one of the latest romantic operas. And there's a lot of problems with this opera in terms of gender, in terms of race. It really kind of reflects a kind of colonial imperial attitude towards women, towards other cultures, towards Chinese culture in particular. And it sort of like appropriates elements of Chinese culture into a Western operatic format. And the gender dynamics are also really problematic. It's basically about this Chinese woman who falls in love with a European war general, and then of course she dies at the end. And so Pauline Oliveros, she says that she used this record by accident, but it really kind of became this sort of feminist statement, as she says here. She says, "It bids farewell not only to the music of the 19th century, but also to the system of polite morality of that age and its attendant institutionalized oppression of the female sex. The title refers to the operatic disc, Madame Butterfly by Giacomo Puccini, which was at hand at the studio at the time and which was spontaneously incorporated into the ongoing compositional mix." Okay, so the piece has an ABA form, which means that it starts out with kind of largely using the oscillators through the tape delay machine. And then in the middle, you hear the record come on. And then at the end, she goes back to exploring the oscillators. So make sure that when you listen to it in the required listening section, that you listen to the entire piece. Because if you just listen to the first few minutes, you'll miss the middle section that includes the opera. Okay, so that's it for part 3 of lecture 8. And up next, we're going to talk about issues of exploitation and appropriation in Steve Reich's Come Out. All right, so now we're going to talk about Steve Reich's Come Out and issues of exploitation and appropriation. And I just want to, before I start, give a little content warning that I'm going to be talking about police brutality against Black teenagers. And I'm not going to show any videos or any visuals, but in your listening, you will hear some recordings. So I just want to give you a heads up about that, that if it's a problem, and if it is a problem, please feel free to let me know, and I can exempt you from listening to this part of the lecture. Okay, so one of the reasons why we're talking about this piece, there's a couple reasons. The first is that Steve Reich made this piece after spending a lot of time at the San Francisco Tape Music Center and basically learning tape techniques there. And the second is that it really touches on a lot of current issues that we're seeing, and especially that we've seen this past summer with police brutality and violence and kind of systemic racism. As well as, the Black Lives Matter movement and things like that. So I'll connect it to that in a minute. So first I want to introduce Steve Reich. He became really interested in using tape loops and phasing while at the San Francisco Tape Music Center. And basically what that means is if you have a strip of tape, you could tape it together and just make a loop and hear the same thing over and over and over again. And what he did was he then took 2 tape machines and 2 identical recordings, so 2 recordings, 2 tape loops that had the exact same content, and he would start them just slightly off from each other. And that created these kind of interesting canons, these kind of phase relationships between the two. And at the time, Reich was really interested in what he called music as a gradual process. And this was very much influenced by composers like Cage and others who were creating new musical or compositional processes, and they wanted to make that process really transparent to the listener. They didn't want to make it so that it was so complex that the listener couldn't understand it. And so I'm just going to read a little bit from this essay that Reich wrote called Music as a Gradual Process. And part of the reason that I want to read this too is that a lot of the composers that we're going to be looking at, or that we did just look at, and that we're going to be looking at in the next few weeks, used very similar processes, and Steve Reich explains it in a way that's really kind of simple and easy to understand. So it's not to necessarily amplify his voice too much as it is that he's just kind of doing something that a lot of other composers were doing at the time, and he explains it really well. Okay, so music is a gradual process. He says, I do not mean the process of composition, but rather pieces of music that are literally processes. I am interested in perceptual processes. I want to be able to hear the process happening throughout the sounding music. To facilitate closely detailed listening, a musical process should happen extremely gradually. Performing and listening to a gradual musical process resembles pulling back a swing, releasing it, and observing it gradually come to rest, turning over an hourglass and watching the sand slowly run through the bottom, placing your feet in the sand at the ocean's edge, feeling and listening to the waves gradually bury them. He said, John Cage has used processes and certainly accepted their results, but the process he used were compositional ones, and that could not be heard when the piece was performed. The process of using I Ching or imperfections in a sheet of paper to determine musical parameters can't be heard when listening to music composed that way. The compositional processes and the sounding music have no audible connection. Similarly, in serial music, the series itself is seldom audible. And he says, what I am interested in is creating a compositional process and a sounding music that are one and the same thing. James Tenney said in Conversation, the composer isn't privy to anything. I don't know any secrets of structure that you can't hear. We all listen to the process together since it's quite audible. And one of the reasons it's quite audible is because it's happening extremely gradually. So I think this is an interesting turn that kind of happens in music at this time, where again, I think James Tenney kind of sums it up by saying the composer isn't privy to anything, and in some ways it kind of flattens a hierarchy between a composer and a listener in which they're kind of brought into the process, they're able to hear the process, there's nothing kind of elided or glossed over, the listener can really hear things. So on its face, this is a very simple and kind of effective idea. Both the use of music as a gradual process and the use of tape machines for creating these phase effects. But the way in which Reich employed these techniques ended up becoming very politically and culturally complicated, basically when we consider the sound sources that he used. So in this piece that we're going to talk about, Steve Reich, as the sound source, the material on the tape loop, used a recording of a 19-year-old teenager named Daniel Ham, who was recounting experiences of being beaten by police. And so the background of this, I'll talk a little bit about Ham's background and how he got to make this recording, and then I'll come back and talk a little bit about why it's problematic that Steve Reich used this recording. So in 1964, Daniel Ham and 6 other black teenagers were arrested for the murder of a shopkeeper in Harlem. And the reason why they were arrested is that they were arrested previously in connection to what was called the Little Fruit Stand Riot. And the Little Fruit Stand Riot, sorry, this is kind of a long story, happened where there was a young girl who was near a fruit stand and she accidentally knocked over some grapefruit. And that kind of led to all these kids coming over and picking up fruit and throwing it at each other. And this was during a time of great kind of unrest in New York City at the time, but also in the country, especially like at kind of the height of the early civil rights movement. And so what happened was there were a lot of kind of policemen in black neighborhoods in New York City, and there were a lot of instances of police brutality. So what we saw in response to these kids accidentally dropping fruit and then deciding to kind of take some or throw it at each other, police came in and started beating these children. And there were a number of black teenagers there, including Daniel Ham, who tried to kind of fend off the police and protect the children. And because of that, they were then arrested and beaten severely by the police. And they were let out the next day, but they then had this criminal record. So then a few days later, when this shopkeeper was murdered, the police couldn't find a suspect and they needed someone to pin it on. And so they were like, there were these teenagers that we just arrested in connection to this riot. They're the perfect people to kind of scapegoat for this crime. And so what we know now is that basically the police fabricated an entire case against these 6 young black men so that they could pin this murder on someone, even though there was zero evidence that they were even remotely related. So they were convicted of murder later because the New York DA did this thing where he basically made it so that none of the men could pick their own lawyers. They were all given a state-assigned lawyer who was kind of in cahoots with the DA. And they were eventually sentenced to life in prison. And this created a huge uproar and a huge backlash. And big civil rights leaders like Amiri Baraka and James Baldwin and others kind of came out in protest of this and said, look, this is wrong. They weren't given adequate representation. They were wrongfully convicted. And ultimately, because of this kind of upset about the outcome of this case, Daniel Ham and the 6 others who were later called the Harlem Six were eventually acquitted, but it took almost 10 years. They were eventually acquitted in 1973, so it took a really long time for them to eventually get acquitted. So this is kind of where Reich comes in. It was kind of in that time where there was backlash against the district attorney of New York and this conviction of the Harlem Six, in which civil rights leaders were trying to put together a benefit to raise money for the mothers of the Harlem Six, who were trying to raise funds to get lawyers and continue the publicity about this case so that they could have an appeal and a retrial. So there was a sort of amateur historian and a civil rights activist named Truman Nelson who recorded interviews with all of the members of the Harlem Six after they were released from prison. And when they were in prison after they had been brutally beaten by police. And some of them sustained really, really long-term effects from that. Truman Nelson approached Reich and said, I have all these recordings, would you help me edit them? And Reich said, I'll help you edit it on the condition that if I find something that's good source material for a piece, that I can use it. And then he said he would let it be performed at this benefit. So when Reich was going through all this material, he found material that he wanted to use for a piece, and it was a recording of Daniel Ham recounting how he opened up a bruise to let blood come out so that he could get medical attention while he was in police custody. So this was, as you can imagine, just like one of the probably the most traumatic event that had ever happened in Daniel Ham's life. It's just a horrible thing to happen to anyone, and also super representative of all of these other instances of injustice and police brutality that have happened to other Black people in the history of the United States. And Steve Reich chose this as source material for a piece of experimental music. And so one of the biggest problems with Reich using this as source material is that even though he got the recording from Truman Nelson, who made the recording, he never asked Daniel Ham for permission, nor did he get consent from Daniel Ham. And he also did not give Daniel Ham any compensation. And I think the thing that's really problematic with that is, sure, at the time he was kind of, like an up-and-coming artist, he might not have had the resources to give Daniel Ham any compensation, but it was later put out on record, and Daniel Ham wasn't given any royalties, and since that time, Steve Reich has become a very wealthy composer, and he could have gone back and given Daniel Ham or his family some compensation, monetary compensation or acknowledgement for his part in this piece, and maybe in retrospect ask for permission or talk about using this at all, and he has done nothing to sort of provide any kind of recuperation or any kind of healing from this process. And there are a couple further issues. So one is the issue of erasure. And there's a scholar named Lloyd Weitzel who talks about this in connection to this piece, where basically because of the process of phasing the tape loops that Steve Reich uses, he's not only using Daniel Ham's voice as kind of musical material, but it also, throughout the course of the recording, erases Daniel Ham's voice. So where at the beginning you can very clearly hear Daniel Ham recounting his experience, by the end his voice has completely disappeared and it's basically just kind of rhythm at that point. Another issue is an issue of appropriation, and this issue comes up throughout Steve Reich's kind of oeuvre as a composer. Basically, he is kind of well known for having a lot of percussion pieces and being very influential and having kind of establishing a lot of the practices of minimalist music, which is again kind of having these like very simple, repetitive rhythmic patterns in his music. And he's very open about the fact that he was super influenced by Western African drumming. And he also, at the same time, he has two tape phase pieces, and the other piece is a piece called It's Gonna Rain, in which he used the recording of a black street preacher called Brother Walter, in a kind of similar move. So we really see, I think, in Steve Reich and his use in particular of black voices in these tape pieces, a kind of common attitude, kind of a colonial attitude towards the use of marginalized voices in recordings, that he just kind of saw these recordings as kind of his for the taking, that he saw no qualms or problems about just using this recording without giving any kind of acknowledgement or compensation to Daniel Ham. And so again, this is kind of sort of a white supremacist attitude towards using the voices of Black people as artistic material. And I think the other issue, the last issue here, is one of exploitation, that he used Daniel Ham's trauma for cultural capital and artistic or aesthetic gain. And that's kind of I think, again, the sort of bottom line, that I think for a number of years after this piece was written, there were a lot of debates about what it meant. And so I've actually linked an article by a scholar named Sumanth Gopinath who talks about the problem of the political in Come Out. And he sort of tries to look at the multiple sides of kind of what was going on and what Steve Reich did and what it means. But I think today, especially in the context of kind of this past summer with the death of George Floyd and the killing of George Floyd and the killing of Breonna Taylor and lots of other Black folks at the hand of police and also of vigilantes, that this is really just clearly wrong to exploit this real trauma and violence that was done to Daniel Ham for his own gain. And this is something I really hope that you all check out Sumanth Gopinath's article, because he also talks about some other articles that talk about Reich's piece, and I'd love to talk to you all more about this in the discussion section. Okay, that's the end of section 4, and next week we'll talk more about live electronic music. Hello everyone. Today we're going to continue talking about live electronic music in the United States in the early 60s and 70s. As I mentioned before when talking about composer John Cage, one of the reasons why I think he was so influential to really contemporary composers is that he, at various points in his career, made pieces using new technology as it became available. So remember, we talked about Imaginary Landscape, which used turntable technology and radio equipment. We then talked about Williams Mix, which used magnetic tape. And what we see is in the 1960s, he starts to use new electronic circuitry technology and things like contact microphones microphones and adapts the use of new technology to his kind of compositional paradigm. And additionally, new electronics also start to shape his compositional paradigm in interesting ways. Um, and just to bring us up to speed, I want to play really quick a clip from an interview that Cage did where he talks about silence. And this is really just to kind of give us some context about how Cage thinks about sound. And so I'm going to play this for you. I'll also include the video at the end of the lecture on the page so that if you have trouble hearing it, you can just go back and play it yourself.
When I hear what we call music, it seems to me that someone is talking and talking about his feelings or about his ideas of relationships. But when I hear traffic, the sound of traffic here on 6th Avenue, for instance, I don't have the feeling that anyone is talking. I have the feeling that sound is acting. And I love the activity of sound. What it does is it gets louder and quieter, and it gets higher and lower, and it gets longer and shorter. It does all those things which I'm completely satisfied with that. I don't need sound to talk to me. We don't see much difference between time and space. We don't know where one begins and the other stops. So that most of the arts we think of as being in time, and most of the arts we think of as being in space. Marcel Duchamp, for instance, began thinking of thinking of music as being not a time art, but a space art. And he made it a piece called Sculpture Musicale, which means different sounds coming from different places and lasting, producing a sculpture which is sonorous and which remains. People expect listening to be more than listening. And so sometimes they speak of inner listening or the meaning of sound. When I talk about music, it finally comes to people's minds that I'm talking about sound that doesn't mean anything, that is not inner, but is just outer. And they say, these people who understand that finally say, you mean it's just sounds? Thinking that for something to just be a sound is to be useless. Whereas I love sounds just as they are. And I have no need for them to be anything more than what they are. I don't want them to be psychological. I don't want a sound to pretend that it's a bucket or that it's a president or that it's in love with another sound. I just want it to be a sound. And I'm not so stupid either. There was a German philosopher who's very well known, Immanuel Kant, and he said there are two things that don't have to mean anything. One is music, and the other is laughter.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there, but you get the sense here of what he's talking about, and I think this is really crucial to understanding both Cage's music and a lot of the other music that we've been talking about in this course. That a lot of these composers become interested in just exploring sound, disconnected from any outside meaning. And that was kind of a revolutionary idea at the time, especially when talking about music. Like he said, for so long, music, especially in Western cultures, was really associated with a lot of outside ideas. For instance, songs or opera or classical music composers, they were often trying to give some sort of message that the music was supposed to carry. And what Cage says is like, look, a lot of that's really just like open to interpretation. So let's just do away with all of that outside meaning and just start to approach and experience and listen to the sounds themselves. And so what we see in the 1960s is that Cage's use of electronics really reflects this idea where he's just trying to explore new sounds and using electronics to kind of open new sounds up. And again, I think that this is partly because Western instruments, things like a violin or a piano, they come with a lot of cultural associations and cultural baggage. So by using electronics, in some ways, it was like a palate cleanser. It was like people didn't necessarily have a lot of given associations with these sounds. So in some ways, it was kind of a way for him to really again, kind of start with kind of a blank slate, more so than with using Western instruments. And that's not to say that he didn't use acoustic instruments or Western instruments in some of his music, but in these pieces, I think it again is a really kind of a chance to explore new kinds of sounds. And I think that's really why he was interested in electronics. So we're going to talk about several pieces. The first that I want to talk about is a piece called Cartridge Music. And this is not one of your required listening pieces, although I will put a link up at the end of the lecture. And the reason why this piece was so important is because it basically provided Cage with a way of thinking about sound and amplifying kind of everyday sounds that became super important to basically how he used electronics and how he composed throughout the rest of his career. So for this piece, Cartridge Music, you can see there's a little bit of a display over here. What he did was he took a phonograph cartridge, and for those of you that have ever used a record player, the cartridge is the thing that's at the end of the arm that the needle is connected to. And what he did was he took that cartridge basically off of the arm, disconnected it and just had it connected to a wire, took out the needle, and instead of having the needle in there, he put other objects in there. So things like a paper clip, a feather, a nail, other objects that he could kind of scrape along surfaces or rub along a surface and to create kind of new sounds. And this led Cage to kind of explore what he started to call small sounds. And small sounds are basically any sound that requires amplification to hear. And one of the ways in which we tend to hear that is by using a contact microphone. And a contact microphone is basically just a membrane with a little piezo disc inside, and piezo discs just have a little crystal in there that act as basically a microphone. And it picks up sounds by just picking up the vibrations on a surface. And so you could pick up very, very quiet sounds by using these contact microphones. And I'll show you one in the next section of the lecture. So Cage started in a lot of his pieces to just put contact microphones on performers, on objects on stage. Say there was a table that the performer was using, he just put contact mics on the table, on the chairs, and that would pick up kind of all these incidental sounds. And as you might remember, one of the things that Cage was really interested in was the element of chance, or just sounds that kind of happen to arise without anyone's intentions. And he thought that these contact mics were a good way to sort of pick up these kind of incidental sounds that would just happen while someone was, say, reading a poem or one of his more text-based pieces. So this again is something that he started to use really throughout his career. And another thing that I want to talk about is that at this time he started to create scores that weren't fully composed scores. It wasn't like first you have like graphics on a page like we saw with Stockhausen's Contacta, where there's, kind of charts and music notation, and it's like, okay, first you do this, then you do this, then you do that. Instead, he gave performers a toolkit with which they could create their own graphical score. And you can see an example of this here. And this is one that's already finished. And what it is, it's a series of transparencies that one would layer on top of each other. So one of the transparencies would just have these dots, one would have these lines, and then one would have this clock. And you can see here the lines. There's different density of lines, so here it's just kind of small dots, here it's solid lines, and then he would basically provide tools to interpret that. And so this kind of gave the performers a lot of agency to create their own score. They often could choose their own material with which they would enact the score, and Yeah, it gave them a lot of agency in which, so that it was more like they were collaborating with Cage to realize his piece. And so this is something that we see with Cage at this time, is that he starts dictating what performers are start supposed to do less and less and less. And to him, that sort of decenters the composer and brings in more and more elements of chance. Another thing that is kind of relevant to what Cage was doing at this time is that from the 1940s to his death in 1992, a lot of his pieces were made to accompany dances by the Merce Cunningham Dance Company. And Cage and Merce Cunningham were both personal and professional partners for that entire time. And so they worked really, really closely together. And what's interesting about Merce Cunningham is he was sort of like the John Cage of modern dance. And so Merce Cunningham was exploring a lot of these same procedures using chants and things like that in his choreography that Cage was exploring in his music. And you can see here, that's John Cage, that's Merce Cunningham, and this is visual artist Robert Rauschenberg, who they also collaborated with quite a bit, and who they all sort of influenced each other. And this is, I think, a really good example of how different arts from different media and people using different media really influenced each other, especially at this time. And another thing that's really interesting that Merce Cunningham and John Cage started to do is they started to completely separate the music and the dance. So it's really common, a lot of you have probably seen choreography set to music. It's really common for the dance to be set to music, that there's specific dance moves that happen along with specific parts of the music. But what Cage and Cunningham started to do is that they would compose and choreograph completely separately. So the music would just happen at the same time as the dance, and they had no relation. And the reason why they found this interesting is that there were these kind of like beautiful moments that would happen by happenstance where it seemed like there were these intentional connections between the music and the dance, but they happened purely coincidentally. And they really tried to create moments like this in the music and the choreography. So another thing that, or a person that Cage was really influenced by at this time was a media theorist named Marshall McLuhan. And a lot of you have probably heard of Marshall McLuhan or his sort of maxim, the medium is the message. And the idea behind the medium is the message is that whatever medium you're using, a pencil and paper, a computer, a cell phone, is going to change in a lot of ways how you send the message or how you communicate the message. So in a lot of ways, the medium itself is kind of sending a great deal of information. The medium is the message. And a great example of this is, say you want to say something on one of your social media platforms. The way in which you would post a similar kind of picture and message or video and message on Instagram would be different than how you would do it on TikTok versus how you would do it on Facebook versus how you might do it on Snapchat. So I think thinking about the different social media platforms is a really kind of helpful way to think about how the medium that you're using slightly changes the way that you're going to send a similar message. And again, this sort of McLuhan's idea is that basically like we're getting a whole lot more information about the medium than we are about like the specific message that you're trying to communicate. And McLuhan, like a lot of the artists that we're talking about, was really influenced by cybernetics and systems thinking. And this is the idea that like he really saw media and technology as basically like both a mapping of environmental ecologies, but also of like the human nervous system, and also like maybe how that human nervous system is interconnected with the environmental ecologies of our surroundings. And he had, again, this kind of really interesting idea that technology itself is also an extension of our human nervous system. And so going back to something like the invention of the wheel, he saw the wheel as an extension of our feet or our legs, and something like a shovel as an extension of our arm. And if you think then about more like digital technology or communication technology, that would then be like extension of, say, our mouths or our brains, things like that. And lastly, he really was interested in how technology ushers in new kinds of social change. And I think he had this really interesting idea, which is that he said that, like, look, technology changes society, and that just happens. And it's the artist's role to sort of translate and mediate this change and use these new technologies in ways that kind of make it make sense to people writ large. So here he sort of sees the artist playing this kind of pivotal role as kind of mediator between technology and societal change, which I think is a really powerful idea for artists, that they're the ones that can kind of give people insight into maybe some of the more creative or positive ways that technology could be used, instead of, say, letting technology companies dictate how we use technology and what technology could mean to our society. And kind of along with this, I'd say it's some other context to what Cage was influenced by at the time. In the 1960s, I think people started to become more and more aware of sort of humans' impact on the environment, and it started to be kind of the early days of the environmental movement. And Cage started to read a lot of Henry David Thoreau in particular. So I think this idea of ecology and ecosystems, both from people like Thoreau and Marshall McLuhan and cybernetics, I think that really started to influence how Cage started to think about technology and about composition. And so what we see is that at this time, Cage starts to think of composition as a sound system, or here I say composition as an ecosystem. And it's this system between humans, electronics, objects, but also spaces, performance spaces. And he starts to create these systems kind of like what we saw with Pauline Oliveros, where it's all these interconnected technologies that are interconnected with people and other objects that create this system that one can explore throughout a performance. And something that I think is really important here is that Cage at this time was really influenced by younger composers, including Pauline Oliveros, Gordon Muma, so people involved with the Once festivals and people that were involved with the Sonic Arts Union. And I think it's really interesting and kind of demonstrates how open Cage was, that he really was allowed himself to be influenced by younger composers, instead of saying, look, I have the answers, I do my thing this one way, and I'm going to continue to do that until my death. No, he was very open to new changes that were happening, and really incorporated a lot of the ideas that he was exploring, that other composers were exploring, like Pauline Oliveros and Gordon Muma, into kind of his own compositional language. So again, I think something that really also is part of this is open scores, and that's another kind of word that I use to describe these kind of toolkit scores. And basically these scores, sometimes they're the toolkits like I described with the transparencies, but other times it was just a list of instructions, of just verbal instructions that would basically tell the performer how to construct a system. So it would say, you know, what kinds of technologies to use, how to connect them, ways to think about the sound. And a lot of these systems include feedback. And again, I think feedback here serves as kind of this, I think it's again connected to cybernetics and these connections between basically human creativity and basically different kinds of feedback that we see in nature and feedback that we see in ecosystems. And I think it also provided a lot of sonic interest. As Cage said, he was just interested in sounds themselves. But this added kind of analog to natural systems of feedback that you might not necessarily be able to control, was also really interesting to him. So one of the pieces that we are going, before I get into this, so some of the things that he might have included in his sound system, you can see here, here's Cage with David Tudor. There's just a table full of electronics. So some of the electronics that he used in his pieces included analog circuitry, so things like kind of homemade oscillators and homemade noise generators, mechanical objects, mechanical noisemakers. He also included magnetic tape, and other kind of more traditional sound makers like radios and phonographs and record players. He included a lot of contact microphones. So you can see this table here. He might have put contact mics on the table, on the chairs, on some of the equipment, so that it would pick up kind of these incidental sounds as they were using all the given electronics. I think in some of these pieces he uses things like Geiger counters. He also then used more kind of traditional sound system equipment like amplifiers, mixers, speakers, and then of course the performance space. So those are some of the things that he would have used in these compositions. So I'm going to talk about a piece from a series that Cage created called the Variation series, and kind of like what we saw with Imaginary Landscape, when Cage tended to explore a new technology, he often kind of clumped pieces together in a series, and he explored these technologies specifically in these series. So the piece that we're going to talk about today, that's one of your required listening pieces, is called Variations 5. And he created this in kind of collaboration with the Merce Cunningham Dance Company, and you'll see why that collaboration was important in a second. And the overarching idea of this piece was inspired by Marshall McLuhan's idea of brushing. And this idea of brushing is the brushing between different mediums. And so what Cage did is he created all of these interconnected networks of different media, including sound, electronics, dancers, visuals, and basically created ways in which they could interact and kind of influence each other throughout the piece. So here I have dance, music, video. So let me talk a little bit about these networks. And he also, as you can see here in this picture, and you'll see later in the video, there were also props. So there were just objects placed throughout the performance space. And he also created this piece in collaboration with David Tudor, who you can see here, and this is Gordon Muma here. So the networks include a network of antennas, and you can see these antennas here, and these antennas are special for a couple of reasons. One is they were created by Robert Moog, who we're going to talk about in Lecture 10. He was the creator of the Moog synthesizer, and something that we'll talk about more in Lecture 10 is that early in his career, he kind of made a living by making theremin creation kits, or homemade theremin kits, where he would give people all the parts and they could assemble their own theremin at home. And so these antennas are basically large theremin antennas, and they can detect when a body is in close proximity to it. So you can see here are two dancers that are in proximity to one of these antennas, and these antennas would then send signals to the mixer, or send a signal to a series of gates that would then open a gate and let sound come out. So when a dancer was close to one of these antennas, it would trigger sound to happen. So you can see here's Tudor, Cage, and Muma, and they're all making these sounds here, but the only way the audience would hear them is if one of these various things were triggered. So if one of the antennas were triggered, the other thing that he had was a network of photocells, and a photocell basically works by it gets sent a continuous feed of light, and if that light source is broken, it sends a trigger signal. So that was another way in which sound was triggered in the piece. He also had a series of contact mics throughout the room that was picking up kind of incidental sound. And then you can see here, Cage, Tudor, and Muma have just this giant table of electronics, and that's things like circuits, radio, tape. So that was like noise generators, oscillators, magnetic tape, record players. They just had all sorts of stuff making sound. And another thing that they had was a 94 input mixer, which was created by another person that we'll talk about later, engineer Max Matthews, who was associated with Bell Labs. And this 94 input mixer, which if any of you are familiar with mixers, that's just like a massive mixer. So there were 94 signals that could be sent to this mixer. So that's just a ton of input for this piece. And the score, sorry about that, was made, what just consisted of 37 remarks. So this is an example of just a text score of written instructions for how to construct a piece like this. So I mentioned that the electronics were made by Muma and Tudor. I should have also included on this slide Moog and Max Matthews. But the visuals for this piece were done by a visual artist and performance artist named Namjoon Paik, who is a Korean, again, performance artist, and we'll talk more about him when we talk about performance art in a couple weeks. And for this, he created projections and video, which also interacted with the system. So they were sort of triggered and triggered sound in return. So here, there's a link to the video here. Hopefully you can be able to watch it on your own. The sound quality is not great, but you should be able to kind of get a sense of how all of these systems interacted with each other. And another piece that I'm not going to talk about in depth, but that you should feel free to look up on your own, it used a really similar sort of system setup is the Variation 7 from 1966. Okay, so that's it for part 1 of lecture 9. Up next, we'll talk about David Tudor and David Tudor's use of analog electronics. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about David Tudor. So David Tudor is probably most well known as one of John Cage's longest collaborators. He played piano. He was sort of a child prodigy, and he played piano on some of Cage's earliest pieces. And he often toured with Cage and was considered kind of one of the only people that could kind of perform his music. But he also performed pieces by Stockhausen and many other composers. But especially for the first 20 years of his career, he was really well known as just a piano performer, and that was kind of it. And he toured again with Cage and the Cunningham Dance Company. And as Cage started to get introduced to these new technologies that we're talking about, things like analog circuitry and creating these compositional systems, Tudor became more and more interested in the possibilities of using these electronics. And you can see here, one of the things that really kicked off his interest is that he collaborated with Cage on one of Cage's variations pieces called Variations 2, where they hooked up all of these circuits and sound signals and things to the piano, and created this kind of really interesting piano feedback system. And that sort of kicked off, in particular, Tudor's interest in electronics and starting to compose on his own. Before this, he didn't really compose. Although, as I did mention before, he did help Cage construct pieces like Williams mix. So he was kind of around and helped aid in the composition of these pieces. So something that I'm going to talk about a lot throughout this section that Tudor was really interested in was the process or the sort of phenomenon of transduction. And this is kind of a fancy word for just saying the sort of conversion of energy from one form into another. And this happens all the time. And I think the most kind of common example of things that is a transducer is a microphone. So you see I got my headphone microphone right here. And what this microphone does is it transduces my acoustic energy of my voice into an electrical signal that then goes into the computer, and then you hear it through your headphones probably, or your computer speaker. That's another transducer. So speakers are also transducers that convert electrical energy into acoustic energy. And Tudor was super interested in this phenomenon of transduction. And so a lot of his pieces explore both feedback and kind of moving energy from one form to another and creating these systems that kind of do that and exploit these kinds of phenomena. Again, like Cage, he also was really interested in kind of creating compositions as electronic systems. And I think Tudor, more than Cage, was interested in exploring the electronics. So Cage created these systems that were, about a lot more than the electronics. They really engaged space, they engaged people, the dancers, and I think for Tudor, he became really, really interested in the electronics. So the first piece that we're going to talk about is a piece called Bandonian Factorial. So that exclamation point here is a factorial. And this was a piece that he composed for an event called the 9 Evenings, which was a series of 9 pieces that were put on and kind of supported in collaboration between Robert Rauschenberg and Bell Telephone Laboratories. And the whole idea was to bring together artists and engineers. And the kind of funny thing, and the reason why I bring up this performance of 9 Evenings, is that Tudor was sort of enlisted to perform a piece by someone else, but he got so into the technology that he completely forgot and ended up performing his own piece. So it's kind of one of those, sort of an interesting situation to happen. So this piece is a kind of sound and light environment. And again, kind of like John Cage's Variations, it includes a number of different kind of networks that I'll kind of explain. So a bandoneon that you'll see here is sort of the central performance mechanism of the piece. And a bandoneon is just an Argentinian accordion. And as a piano player, he was sort of well suited to play an accordion. So what he did for this piece, at first he attached a bunch of contact microphones inside of the bandoneon. And a contact microphone looks like this. So this is a little piezo disc, and you can see here it's attached to a little wire. And contact microphones are really an interesting example of a transducer because they can act as both a microphone and as a speaker. So you can both feed sound through it, and you can also pick sound up out of it. And that's partly why these were so useful to David Tudor, as we'll see later. So he put a bunch of these inside the bandonion that picked up the bandonion sound, and then he fed that sound through a bunch of non-linear circuits and other electronics. So nonlinear circuits are the kind of circuits that we talked about when we talked about Louis Barron. So that's basically a chaotic circuit, which makes chaotic or unpredictable sounds. And a chaotic oscillator, one thing that's interesting about a chaotic oscillator is that it'll kind of go back and forth between creating sounds that sound more of like a sine tone, so just like a pure tone, and a noise tone, so like pure white noise. And it kind of goes between the two, and it'll find states of kind of equilibrium where it'll kind of be in a loop, where it'll just do noise, or go back and forth between noise and kind of more pure tones, back and forth, and they make these really, really interesting sounds. So another aspect of this piece is that the audio controlled a series of visuals. So there were lights around the space that were controlled by what was happening with the sound. And another aspect of the piece is a series of 4 transducer speakers. And transducer speakers are this kind of invention that Tudor came up with that he used throughout his career in several other pieces. And that's where he kind of converted different objects. He sort of said Carter's music style, where he basically would get an everyday object, like say a baking sheet, and he would attach a contact microphone, and he would also attach maybe a small speaker or another transducer. And what that would do is he would feed in an oscillator signal or one of these chaotic oscillator signals. So that would feed this sound into the object, and then it would be picked up with the contact microphone. And that would create these really interesting kind of instances of feedback. And another thing, a way to think about it, is that this is sort of like an acoustic filter of an electronic sound. And the reason why it's acoustic is like an object like a baking sheet or like a money box or like a wooden shelf or something like that, is that those are just like, if you hit on it, you hear acoustic sound. It's not electronically produced sound. So that's a way to acoustically filter electronically generated sound. And a way to think about the reverse of that is with someone like Gordon Muma and his piece Hornpipe, which is electronically filtering acoustic sound. So in that case, the acoustic sound is the French horn that's being electronically filtered through his cybersonic console. And then the last piece of this is that he had a series of 12 speakers that were these kind of robot speakers that moved around the space. And so that further kind of sent sound out. But as you can imagine, there are these contact mics on everything that are kind of then picking up and reinforcing some of those signals. So it was this real kind of chaotic system. And I've included a link to this in your required listening section, but I'll also put it at the end of the lecture as well. Okay, so that gets us to the last piece, which is a piece called Rainforest. And this is basically a piece based on these transducer speakers, and it just consists of these transducer speakers, where he got oscillators that were then sent through a transducer, often a small speaker, that were attached to everyday objects, that were then picked up by a contact microphone and then sent out. That whole signal was then sent out to larger speakers. And that, again, creates these kind of really interesting instances of feedback. And this piece, Rainforest, was composed to accompany a dance by the Merce Cunningham Dance Company called Rainforest. And the props, these kind of silver floating balloon pillow things, were created by Andy Warhol. So it just created kind of this interesting sonic movement visual system with the feedback system and everything else. So again, I put both a video and MP3 of Rainforest that you can listen to in your required listening section. Okay, that's it for Lecture 9. Please feel free to put any questions that you might have in the discussion section.